I want to welcome our viewers back to Conversations with John, where every week we bring in a leader from across the life of the denomination and just have some conversation. In this season, we've been focusing on our adaptations to the pandemic. And this week, I am really pleased to have my friend and the current president of United Theological Seminary, Lew Zeidner, with us. Lew, welcome. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and what you're currently doing?
Well, thanks, John. I'm really glad to be here today, and thanks for the invitation. I've been president at United for about 4 years. June will be the end of my fourth year. Prior to that, I was trained as a clinical psychologist. I've been in various aspects of healthcare business for most of my career. This was somewhat of an unexpected next step in my career, but one that I've enjoyed immensely, and we can talk more about that as we go. So thank you.
Let me start with this. As a clinical psychologist, what are you witnessing as the church and the culture adapts to this pandemic? And what is it from that background that equips you to deal with what you're witnessing and seeing?
You know, it's kind of an interesting question, because I think it's one that we're all, as both individuals and as professionals, kind of using. We're in real-time sociological history. What I see is two levels of response. One is at the very personal level, and I see a great deal of pain at a personal level. I see that pain in terms of people without work, without financial security, food insecurities, housing insecurities, many of the things that just get exacerbated in a crisis like this, for the folks, particularly students of ours, who are, with minimal safety nets in many of those capacities. And I think we've all had a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of uncertainty, a certain amount of concern about what does the future look like, both for us as individuals, for us as family units, and for us as institutions. At the institutional level, I see a great deal of resilience. I see institutions like United, like the church in general, finding creative ways to adapt. One of the things in my profession that people talk a lot about is sort of trauma-informed care, care for people that takes into consideration the traumas that they've experienced through their lives and through their experiences. And in that same context, society focuses a great deal on the triggering aspects of trauma, the ways in which that we get re-traumatized by similar experiences as we go forward. But I also think the flip side is true, is that we build resilience. That as individuals, as family units, as institutions, that trauma is painful, causes difficulty, and also, to the extent that we survive, creates an opportunity for building a resilience, a sense that we know we can survive. We know that we can manage through crises and be successful. And I see a lot of that at the institutional level, and certainly at the individual level, is that people are being resilient and finding new ways and finding creative ways to both survive in isolation and also survive as institutions. So that's probably my biggest takeaway of watching people respond to this.
Well, thank you for that. Let's talk about your institution. You are a seminary president, and
Yes.
We've all, whether we're parents of children, whether we're students ourselves, or even graduates now in ministry, we've all been aware that our educational institutions and institutions of higher learning have had to go through enormous adaptations in this season. What has that been like for you? What are some of the decisions that you've had to make and are now faced with? And how is your institution adapting in this time for the sake of the mission that you have to prepare leaders for ministry and the life of the church?
What's interesting is, and some of this is luck, some of this is good fortune, and some of this is planning. But in many ways, we were well prepared for this, not in the context of pandemic, certainly, but in the context of an evolving need for how we address education, particular higher education at a seminary level. And so about a year ago, a little over a year ago, we moved our campus. And one of the drivers of moving that campus was to be able to use technology more effectively for education. What we were seeing at that time and continue to see is more students not wanting to be in residence for their seminary education, having multiple responsibilities in their lives, and therefore needing to participate from a home base that oftentimes is not adjacent to the seminary. And so what we had over time developed are good teaching methodologies in the classroom, use of technology to allow for students to some be in the classroom and some be outside the classroom, and to work together in the classroom. As we moved, we were able to expand the use of technology beyond the walls of the classroom to include other aspects of importance in seminary education, the ways that we practice worship together, the ways that we have small group discussions, the ways in which much of the work of seminary education happens outside of the classroom, in addition to the important work in the classroom. And so with that, we invested a lot in technology, but we also invested a lot in new pedagogies, new ways for teachers to use their skills at educating in broader ways. It is different to teach remotely than it is to teach, in person. There are other ways that we need to look at how we do community. How do we include people who are both present and people who are adjacent? All of those activities and all of that practice has served us well as we've moved into the pandemic response. And so in actuality, it was a matter of an email to say we're closing the campus and we're going to do all things remotely. And it was sort of a non-event in the context of education. Now, certainly for many people across our institution or across our community, this has been profoundly painful. And so I don't mean to minimize that experience, but what I do mean to say is the actual experience of education, the experience of seminary education has been sort of a non-event change as we've responded, because much of that work happened in preparation for moving to a more distance education model.
And just to follow up then, your prospects for returning in the fall, you anticipate it will be as much a non-event as you come back for the start of another school year?
What's been interesting is two things. One is the things that presidents worry about, the deans worry about, are new admissions and persistence of existing students. Those are two important metrics that people who run seminaries and education institutions worry about. And in both of those contexts, our persistence rates are very high. We saw fewer drops between spring and summer than we have in the last 3 years. So people are staying in school, and we have more inquiries and more applications for the fall term than we have in many years. So we are looking at a significant increase in enrollment as we move towards fall. Certainly students want to know, will we be live, will we be in person, or will we continue to be fully online? And my guess is, although this has not been announced and we have not made this decision fully yet, my sense is we will err on the side of safety.
Yeah.
And we will err on the side of keeping students and faculty and staff as safe as we can, while also looking at creative ways to do community. So I think the spring term, the second half of the spring term, the summer term, fully online, and we've been sort of learning how to do socialization in a distance way. I think fall we'll see more small group events and other ways that we can be with each other, perhaps with a little less social distancing, but still keeping people as safe as possible, creative use of schedule and creative use of ways of keeping people safe. So those are the things that we're focused on, but I think the education component will be sort of business as usual, continuing to teach students to be well prepared for their careers.
I think it bears repeating, and not just for those who run institutions and seminaries as you, but for those in leadership in the church, if you're going to err on the side of caution and safety for your members and your student body. That bears repeating. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you.
United has made historic commitments through the years to racial diversity, both in its student body and in its faculty, and I would add in its pedagogies. One of the things that we're witnessing in this time of pandemic is, although on the one hand you can argue a virus doesn't discriminate, we are clearly looking at indications that a virus within a structure that discriminates means that the vulnerable in terms of racial populations are bearing the higher cost and burden. I wonder, as a seminary president with clear commitments to racial diversity and racial equity, what is there to be said? What witness do you and the leaders that you're training bring to bear within a structure like the one we live in here in the US, where predominantly people of color are bearing the weight of this pandemic?
That's something we spend a lot of time thinking about and focusing on. And I think it's been a topic that has evolved in seminary education, particularly in ecumenical progressive seminary education. What we have seen through the last 20 some odd years is a movement away from sort of the traditional seminarian being white, male, middle class, and comparable demographics, to a much more diverse seminarian. And with that diversity has brought a whole host of new challenges for education and also opportunities for education and the church. So for example, about half of our student population is chronically food insecure. About 75% of our students work separate from their seminary education in jobs which would otherwise be seen as entry-level jobs, jobs in Walmart, in Starbucks, in other places. And all of that creates the very vulnerability that you talk about as we look towards the pandemic and other stressors of our society. Because the first people furloughed, the first stores to close, the first places to send employees away without compensation have been those larger format retail and service level jobs, which means that as an organization, we've had to look at how do you help support people? How do you help to ensure that they're able to continue in their education, understanding that their safety nets, thin as they were, are no longer present even during a pandemic as we're facing. So as we look at, the whys and the hows of how does the pandemic differentiate between peoples in our society, I think very much looking at the privilege I have of being able to work from home since the pandemic became a critical issue. And no one has talked to me about furloughing me. No one has talked to me about whether or not seminary president should still be in place. But many of our students have had that experience. And so we have looked carefully at ways that we can use scholarship dollars differently, that we can use a rainy day food fund differently. Chronically, what we do at the seminary is have food available just for the taking. And obviously with the seminary being closed as a physical plant, that's more difficult. But are there ways that we can support people? And if nothing else, to be present for them, to be aware, to be conscious, and to be able to support, if not financially, in other ways. As an organization, we continue to do work ourselves. I think there are many stages of doing work around being a more just society. And one of the things that we've had to do is really stop and focus on ourselves. Where are we discriminatory, whether or not by intent? What is our impact? How receptive are we to variances in our community? And how do we best support that through time? So we're not there yet. We're continuing to work every day. We do work in that area, but it's certainly front and center in our consciousness.
Well, thank you, Lou. As always, anytime that I have in conversation with you, both goes too quickly and leaves me with wanting more. I want to thank our viewers for tuning in once again to these conversations. I want to thank our conversation partner this week, Lew Zeidner. And as promised, Lou, I'm going to give you the last word to our viewers.
Thanks. Well, I think my biggest takeaway from this is there's a lot of pain that comes with the pandemic. And there's also a lot of opportunity to test our institutional mettle to make sure that we are looking at the future in a resilient way. And I look forward to the next step of this process in our society, not simply being how do we return to normal, whatever normal was, but how do we use the learnings of this pandemic to be a better society, a more just society, and a better church. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Lou. Well said. And thank you to our viewers. We'll return again soon with Conversations with John.